Hello and welcome to It Means What It Means, the podcast in which a guy with some college and a day job has long-form conversations about biblical texts. I'm sure you noticed there was no cold open on the front end. Ordinarily, I will have a clip of today's episode starting us out, kind of welcoming you into the episode with a highlight from the conversation you're about to hear. I did not do that today because I'm trying to pull about a 30-second clip for those cold opens, and I did not know how to do that in a conversation like this one where there's two people, because I wanted to represent both voices, and the things that we're talking about are so involved. So I'm sorry. I will look into ways of figuring that out in the future when I have more than one guest. But for now, hello, it's me, it's Jared. I appreciate you listening, and I hope you guys enjoy this conversation. This is the first, as of recording this intro, I have 5 episodes on this book, Ancient Slavery in its New Testament Context, and it's kind of going to be my trend with regard to books that have multiple contributors going forward. I want to have the editors or editor on first. So that'll just be my standard going forward with these kinds of things. All that to say, Christy, Cobb, and Katherine Shaner, who edited the book, also contributed chapters of their own. And we do kind of touch on that a little bit, not as much as I would have hoped, but I think some of that was me just holding back because I didn't really know how to manage a conversation with two people. Again, I hope it went well. Please give me feedback on that. I'd love to hear what you have to say. So keeping this really short on the front end of things, hit me up at itmeanswhatitmeans@gmail.com with any feedback, guest suggestions, or just any communication that you want to have with me. If you have an organization that you want shouted out on the podcast, however much that may or may not help, I don't know, but just let me know. Give me a heads up at itmeanswhatitmeans@gmail.com. If not there, any of the number of social media accounts that are out there for the podcast, they're there for you to subscribe and see what's going on. I'm working on getting way out ahead of the work that I have in front of me so that I can start projecting well in advance of what's going on, so that everyone will know, hey, here's who's coming up on the podcast. Or if you're listening to this for free, for $5 a month, you can get audio or video, and it comes out about 10 days early on there. Whereas, right now, every Wednesday, if you subscribe, you can get an episode for free on any of the multitude of podcast platforms that are out there. But for $5 a month, patreon.com, and the link is in the show notes here. I would really appreciate the support. As I've said in the past, I want this to be my day job at some point, and I don't really want to have to do that with ad revenue. I want to build an audience and cultivate relationships with people, delivering conversations that are helpful and instructive and educational for them, in exchange for $5 a month. So I'll keep working on putting stuff out, and spread the word, help me out, or chip in $5 a month if that's what you want to do. Okay. Enjoy my conversation with Christy Cobb and Katherine Shaner. Thank you. Katherine Shaner and Christy Cobb, welcome to the podcast.
Hi.
Thank
Good
you.
to see you.
It's okay. Again, it's okay if you talk over each other. For the listeners' benefit, I just want to call out name order. We'll probably go in that Katherine and then Christy, and that is just pre-agreement based on the first question that I'm going to be asking. But before we get going into that, actually, the first question I always ask is, tell us a little bit about yourself. So we'll jump in. Katherine, tell us a little bit about yourself, and then Christy, I'll throw that question to you.
All right. Thanks, Jared. Katherine Shaner. I teach New Testament at the Wake Forest University School of Divinity. Um, and what else do you need to know about me? I have been on this journey of New Testament scholarship for a really long time. I started back in undergrad when I took Greek and have been working through both archaeology and Greek ever since. Most of my research is in slavery, and the ways that slavery plays out in theological and historical modes within early Christianity. And one of the things I think that podcast listeners might want to know about me is that I'm also a Lutheran pastor. So I teach at the School of Divinity, which means I teach people who are going into professional ministry, but I also do some preaching on the weekends and do a lot of teaching in churches, and am connected with particularly mainline denominations.
Okay, cool. Now,
Also,
Christy.
I'm originally from Nebraska. I should
Yeah,
probably
originally, yeah, we were
too.
discussing that beforehand, but now she lives close enough
No.
to the beautiful Old Dominion, the Commonwealth of Virginia. But so, Christy, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yes, so I'm an associate professor at the University of Denver. So I'm out in Denver, Colorado. I'm originally from Tennessee and also did some years of teaching in North Carolina before that. Like Kat, I'm a specialist in New Testament and early Christianity, and I focus on slavery, with the addition that I focus on issues of gender and sexuality. So I write a lot about enslaved women, and do a bit of work trying to determine issues of gender related to slavery in the ancient world.
And so, in addition to being editors, you are contributors. And I didn't put it in the questions. Normally, I would have put it in the questions, but I wanted to pay the same respect to each of you in the questions that I sent you to show that I had read your contributions and I had considered them, so that you would know where my mind was. But Christy, your chapter is gender and sexuality, and Katherine, yours is household codes. So where we dip into your respective contributions to this particular book, which is ancient slavery and its New Testament contexts. Not that either of you are limited only to what you wrote. You whether you need it or not, you have my permission to speak about whatever you like while we're here. But that's what each of you contributed to this book. So the first question is going to be, and again, so we'll start with Katherine. And for anyone listening for the first time, this is my first interview of more than one person. So anything that goes wrong is entirely the responsibility and cause, like I'm the cause of it. So, but we'll start with Katherine. Let's get into the story of how the two of you decided to get this book together.
Yeah, I love this story actually because it circles around to so many different networks, which is true of what happens in biblical scholarship a lot of times. Christy and I knew of each other while we were writing our respective dissertations. I finished a little bit before she did, and our dissertation advisors are good friends, and so they had introduced us early on, and then during the pandemic, we decided to just try and start a group of women in Bible over Zoom. And Mary Foskett, who is my colleague here at Wake Forest, had said, hey, you and Christy should chat with each other. And Christy and I started talking, and I knew that she taught a course on slavery in the New Testament. And I asked, look, what textbook do you use? Because I've been desperate for a good textbook, something that my students who have absolutely no background can pick up and dive into. And she said, I don't really have one. And so we started then dreaming. We started brainstorming, and we realized that we needed to write one, but we didn't want to just write it ourselves because there's so many great voices who are working on slavery in the ancient world, slavery in the New Testament, Jewish slavery, early Christian slavery. So we got all of our all-stars together, and some of them said, yeah, sure, I'd love to write for you. And others said, I really would love to support you in it. And so the dream was born. We got together this group of scholars that you see here, and these are not the only scholars who have made a difference on this volume, but they are the ones who ultimately wrote for us. And we're looking forward to seeing how it works in classrooms.
And where do you pick up in that story? What's your version now that we've heard one side?
Yes. Yes. I mean, I think I think one interesting thing about what Katherine and I kind of together contribute is that she's teaching in a context of mostly graduate students, master's students, and in a more theological sort of context. And I was and am teaching more undergraduates. And so I was teaching at an undergraduate only institution in North Carolina. And now I teach both undergraduates at Denver and graduate students. But we basically saw the need for this book that would speak to both contexts, right? That undergraduates could pick up with no knowledge of ancient slavery or of the New Testament and could read, and that graduate students could engage and deepen their study. And then also because of what Katherine said about her background with pastoral connections as well, that people in churches who are interested in slavery in the New Testament could pick up. And read and sort of understand more of the dynamics from the historical context.
I think so. Before I get into the questions about your respective chapters in the book, that is an interesting dichotomy. That on one end, the point of view that your students show up with in your courses may be more theological, and on the other end, less theological. And so, are we trying to like split the difference? Like, is that what you want to see? Like, let's take the two and average it out, and that's the best we can do. Or so is balance the objective, or is there some kind of a like fullness defined in how you think people should be reading slavery in biblical texts? And whoever wants to start talking first.
Well, okay, so I will. This is Katherine, and I'll start. I think it's fullness, because the truth is that people who walk into Christy's classroom and people who walk into my classroom often have the same questions. It's just what they want to do with the knowledge that they're there for, whether it's formative liberal arts knowledge or, in my case, professional ministry knowledge. And so for my students, from the theological point of view, I do need them to get to some kind of a theological understanding of what these texts are doing in the world right now and within their communities and across communities. But I first need them to understand the cultural context. And I first need them to understand some history. And I first need them to understand how inextricably embedded these New Testament texts are in the ancient world and the ancient world's concepts of slavery. Whether that's gender and sexuality or race and ethnicity or violence and its aftermaths. So I think we have different audiences, but very similar goals. And that's why this works.
And I'll add to that I think that's another reason that we pulled in scholars from a variety of spaces and places, actually throughout the globe, is because they're also coming from these different perspectives. We have a few writers that are included in the volume that are very theologically focused and want to answer those questions of, for example, one of the chapters by Midori Hartman discusses the questions of how do we, if you read the Bible as the sacred word of God, and the Bible also affirms slavery in a number of places, what do you do? How do you proceed, right? And so that chapter really gives a good introduction for people coming from that perspective to say, well, how do I even start reading this text when I'm coming from this particular perspective? And then we have some other scholars that are coming from the fields of classics, fields of history, of Jewish studies, that are coming not from within Christianity, but that are coming from the perspectives of the history of Roman slavery or perspectives of ancient Jewish slavery, for example. And so that, I think that diversity of voices also brings to the fullness that Katherine just answered about of the book, that we're bringing these variety of perspectives, and then readers from their own place can tap into.
And so, full disclosure for listeners, I have not read the whole book. maybe this will come across as an excuse, but if you have ever listened to this podcast before, you know that in talking to someone, I regularly hear the answer, well, I'm not really an expert in that. So when I look at something that's a collection of contributions, I do not want, and I'll just name, I'll throw the name Jeremy Williams, who I was telling Katherine I was very excited, past guest, looking forward to having him on to talk about this, but I did not want one contributor's contribution, a chapter, to bleed into my thinking when it came to yours, and that's out of deference to you trying to discuss your actual work. But so getting into your chapters, and so since we started with Katherine on the story, I'll stick with starting with Katherine. The first question I sent you about your chapter: how could someone be enslaved to their husband? I honestly thought that was like beyond the pale, but that was the most shocking fact I learned.
Well, okay. Well, I'm glad you learned that shocking fact, because it's actually quite an important one, I think, in the history of slavery generally. So, how do we start? There's so many places to start. So the first place I think that I would start is thinking about the idea of marriage in the ancient world. By and large, in the Roman world, unless you were propertied or a citizen, you couldn't officially marry. So the legal marriage piece had you had to have a certain status. You had to be free, whether that was freeborn or a freed person, in order to officially legally be married. Now, there were, of course, religious rituals. We know from Judaism that there's religious ways that religion comes into marriage in the ancient world. But enslaved people generally, even if they were marrying other enslaved people, weren't allowed to legally marry. So what do I mean when I say that enslaved people could marry, or enslaved women could marry their husbands? What I mean by that is often there's a coupling that happens where children are produced, right? And there are ways in which this gets really messy in the ancient world because, for example, there's one example in the book from Javal Coleman's chapter on Roman slavery, and it's an inscription to Julia Procula, who's a child who's died, and the inscription is dedicated by her parents, Euphrosyne, and her mother, who is erased out from the front of the inscription. But if you go around to the back of this little monument, you see a curse inscription where the mother is named. Her name is Acte. And Acte, it seems, was owned by Euphrosyne, right? So she was owned by the man who she had a child with. But we think that she was freed. She was a freed woman. And we think that Euphrosyne freed her in order to marry her. But then she poisons Euphrosyne. She takes a bunch of his slaves and enslaved children, which might actually be her children. We don't know. And she absconds with a couple of other enslaved folks. And Euphrosyne is cursing her and cursing her memory for doing this. But one of the things that inscription really shows us is just how fraught sexual relationships are between enslaved people and their enslavers in particular. I think about the controversy with Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, right? That's a controversy that we often talk about. And, we often use it to talk about consent. We often use it to talk about abuse of power. We often use it to talk about sexual assault. And I think we can talk about all of those issues in these relationships in antiquity as well. So certainly there were folks who fell in love. If you want to be romantic, we can still have that as part of the world of enslavement. But the power dynamic almost always completely overshadows any of the emotional sentiment that we often want to place on these relationships.
And I did not mean for that first question to be one that worked so well as a segue from Katherine's contribution into Christy's contribution, but it really is. So when we're talking about the power differential there, I mean, there's this whole a spectrum of gender and sexuality and how they work socially do you? I hate to do the talk about, but Christy, do you mind? Just because I have too many things in my head, I can't. I don't even my specific question, but like, what? How do these things of gender, sexuality, class, all of those kinds of things? What is the confluence within ancient society?
Absolutely. Yeah. Gender relations within antiquity were very much entangled with class, with status, right? With even race and ethnicity, all of these issues. And so I think, especially when we're thinking about enslaved persons in antiquity, the gender dynamics were really fraught. And so in a similar way as we Katherine described from the previous question, I think it's that when we can't erase someone's gender from their status, right? So, to give an example, an elite woman who would have been free would have had gender expectations placed upon her, such as that her body was to be protected. She was to act in a certain way according to gender norms, such as that she might be more, more passive in her engagements, or she's expected to be. But because she's free, she has a little bit more wiggle room in terms of her gender performance, let's say. And a female enslaved person, those gender expectations would have been similar, but in a lot of ways very different. For example, an enslaved woman, there was no way that her body could be protected from sexual advances. In fact, as an enslaved woman, she probably would have been subjected to sexual advances from men in her house, right, who were her enslavers, and maybe even other men outside of the house that were, viewed her as basically a body able to be violated. And so while a free woman would be expected to keep her body pure for her future husband or her current husband, an enslaved woman had no ability to do that, and instead would have been viewed as sexually available, even if she wasn't wanting that to be the case, and even if she was married, or committed to another person. And so that's one way in which the gender and sexuality is entangled with status.
And this is kind of a societal ideal that's Aristotelian. And you know what? I'm okay if in this podcast he's like a mustache twirling villain. I really am okay with that. He has yet to come up on this podcast in the over 2 years I've been doing it. He has yet to come up as anything other than like just a dum-dum or a villain. But and you know what? What's he going to do about it? And Aristotelians can come on and fight me. I don't care. But that is articulated in your chapter, Katherine, about household codes. And so society begins in the home, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, so I would actually flip Aristotle into a different mode. So instead of talking about him as the guy who orders domestic life, and I maybe I agree with you, Aristotle. Oh, I spent so much time thinking about that guy. But Aristotle, what he's actually really trying to do in the Politics, which is what always gets cited for the household codes, is that he's working out the ideal political organization for a city. And this has to do with Athenian democracy, Greek democracy in particular. Now, he's trying to work out this ideal political organization, but his question isn't, okay, so how do people behave within a household? His question is, who gets to represent other people at the Athenian ecclesia, at the assembly? And so ultimately what he ends up saying is, look, it's the free propertied males who really should represent everybody else. And so then he needs to find a way to make sure that the women who are articulate and rational and reasonable and probably smarter than their men, okay, I might be a feminist.
I'll allow it.
he needs to find a way to make sure that the women, that the enslaved people who might also be rational, reasonable, have good speech, be able to talk about governance, he needs to figure out a way that they're not going to be included in that democratic assembly. And so what he essentially does is says, okay, look, the women, they only have enough rationality to run the house and the farm. The slaves, they only have enough rationality to and virtue to follow what their masters say. The animals, they have a voice, but they don't have any real rationality in terms of decision making. And so why don't we just make sure, because the women, the slaves, and the animals all make the free property male's life possible, so that he can be the studious one and the one who goes to the assembly. Let's organize our households that way, and that's how we'll decide who gets to speak in the assembly. And some of this I have to give a debt to Anna Miller, who writes on democracy in ancient Athens as a category that helps explain Paul in 1 Corinthians. I gotta give Anna Miller a lot of credit for helping me figure Aristotle out. But here's the thing: Aristotle, he also acknowledges that this is not the only way to politically organize a society. And he actually also acknowledges that there's a counter argument that slaves should be part of this assembly. And I think it's really fascinating then to see that we talk about Aristotle making this argument about natural slavery, but he's understanding the flaws in his own argument in certain ways. Not to excuse him, but to say that by the time we get to Arius Didymus, who's also in my chapter, he's the guy who kind of brings Aristotle into the empire. And then by the time we get to the household codes a century later, so you got like a century or two in between all these folks, by the time you get to the household codes, it's not an inevitability that this is how society is going to be organized. And it's not an inevitability that this is how a household, a group of folks are organized. In fact, I think that the Pauline household codes in particular, the one in First Peter as well, are making an argument that this is how things should be done. But I don't think it's actually how households were organized. And we see some of that in my chapter, and even in some of Christy's work, where we start to see Lydia as a household owner, right? In the Acts of Paul and Thecla, you get Tryphena, who seems to have a group of women as her household, right? So we have these examples that show us that this structure that Aristotle puts out that comes into the household codes is not actually how early Christians were living and organizing their worlds. But there's a lot to be said for early Christians trying to create a structure of singular power, which is what happens in the empire, which is what happens in some of Paul's letters. And I'm just going to leave that dangling, because I think that's another conversation.
Well, there's a lot. So it's interesting. You brought up Thomas Jefferson a minute ago, and I don't remember where I heard this, but somebody was basically saying his whole articulation of the yeoman farmer when he was a failure as a farmer, and obviously that's not what you were bringing up, but there's an ideal that one can articulate, and then there's the reality that we'll find, whether it's in the archaeological record or in the actual recorded texts. And it would be great if we were done with these arguments. And I'll kind of throw this to Christy, but it seems like a lot of this, it's an artifact. This is a cultural artifact. Slavery, gender, our understanding of how gender and sexuality coalesce, that they're artificial. And I don't mean they're fake for listeners. I mean that they're made by people. So what is the overlap between what Katherine's talking about with household codes and how society at large is being structured around this ideal, and gender and sexual identity, and how it applies within society, but particularly with slaves? Is there, can you bring all these loose thoughts that I just threw at you together for me?
I think so. I can try. Because ideologically, we have this presentation of what enslavement is supposed to be, right? And what it's supposed to look like. And that's very similar to actually the gender norms and the expectations of that. But then on day-to-day life, people lived, differently than what the ideological expectations were, right? So as I think as Katherine was saying about for Aristotle presenting this in very particular ways, when we actually look in peek inside households, we see ways in which people are resisting those ideological norms, right? And we also see ways in which enslaved persons were attempting to, form their own families, even though legally they weren't allowed to, right? Or explore their own gender expression, even though philosophically their gender was put in a box by these particular ancient writers. And so I think we do see quite a difference in what might be the, let's say, day-to-day life of a family, an early Christian family in a household, for example, or of an enslaved person living in a day-to-day life that is not going to exactly match what we read in Aristotle or what we read even sometimes in the New Testament. We're going to see differences in those.
So, and this is for both of you, however you want to take it. So the terminology, and I'm not sure how well, how faithfully I have stuck to what I've sussed out and what you articulated as the terminology you wanted used in the book. But I know I was first exposed to it by Dr. Haley Gabriel. She wrote an article about Galatians. And I don't think that I had ever heard anyone explain why they would say enslaved person as opposed to slave. So if you want to talk about broadly the terminology that's applied in this book, I'd love to hear you talk about that. But then, are there any ways that either you or other contributors in this book were looking to maybe innovate, or was it all just kind of taking accepted academic or scholarly approaches to the dialogue around enslaved people?
I can take this one. I have a actually forthcoming article that should be coming out that is talking about the translations of our terms related to slavery. I've co-wrote it with Chance Bonar, who's one of the contributors in this book. Because of these questions, it's a really, we're all sort of navigating terminology when it comes to slavery in the ancient world. And so what we've seen is a progression from translators that were translating terms like doulos, doule, as servant, right? So that's sort of where this conversation begins, which really that translation softens what would be the reality of slavery. There weren't indentured servants in antiquity. There were people who were enslaved. And so using the term servant makes it seem as if there might have been some choosing of that life or some some aspect there, when really that was not present. And so we moved from translating things as servant into slave. And then now sort of a more current trend is using the term enslaved worker, enslaved person. And what that is an attempt to do is to sort of regain the or acknowledge the agency that surrounded enslaved persons and enslavement in antiquity. So this is taking a cue really from transatlantic scholars of slavery. And so there's a number of scholars who are in slavery studies in our sort of more current context who have made an argument that the word slave and the word slave owner and the word slave holder, for example, is really acknowledging that this is an ideology of ownership, right? That this human is owned by another human. And a slave is an object that can be owned by someone called a master or a mistress or an owner, right? And so when we say enslaved person, then that leans into the more agency-centered approach for translation for that. So I will say, when writing this book, Katherine and I both were leaning into this more agency-centered language. So using enslaved persons, using enslaver instead of master mistress. But our authors within the book come from a variety of perspectives. And we did basically encourage them to use whatever language that they felt comfortable with. And so this is a bit of a conflict, right? Because the ancient texts do I mean, they're using the ideologies of slavery, and they're written within the systems of slavery, and so they are referring to a doulos, and as a slave, who the writers would believe could be owned by another human, right? And so there is a way in which you could translate that, as slave owner. But when we are ethically looking back on this, conversation, there are some scholars who are pushing towards using the terms enslaved person, enslaved worker, and enslaver in order to resist the language of ownership. Do you want to add to that, Katherine?
I was just gonna add a couple of pieces from the
Yeah.
book, thinking about
Oh, good.
Emerson Powery's contribution and the way that he discusses translation in the New Testament, because of course this is also an enormous issue in terms of translation, and which translation you pick up, which English language translation you pick up. So he's really drawing cues off of Clarice Martin, who's a womanist biblical scholar who wrote this paradigmatic article back in 1990 about how to translate eved, which is the Hebrew word for slave, and doulos, which is the Greek word for slave. And one of the things that I love about Martin's article, and that Powery also brings in, is this idea that your audience context is everything when it comes to these words, right? So, Martin talks about the ways in which her own communities appreciate some of the softer tones of servant, precisely because there are other things in their communal life that need to be worked through with the text. Whereas in, say, my mainline white Protestant context, I need my folks to understand exactly how thoroughgoing enslavement and slavery is in the New Testament. And so I often go and retranslate, because there's even verbs of enslavement. Like the verb doulo is often used as serving or working, but it's really slaving. It's a very particular word. So between Powery's what would you call it? His he really works through some of the issues of translation, and takes to task some of the mainline Protestant translators who have shied away from putting this thoroughgoing enslavement into our English translation that's really very prevalent and very there in the Greek.
It seems like on the one hand, you could look at it as we need to clearly identify, so saying enslaver rather than master or owner is identifying it, and it is a judgment call. There is a moral and ethical judgment call being made there. But I think rather than simply that, which is kind of that is a negative thing, right? You want to negatively associate, or you want to associate negative ideas with these actions without removing the historical understanding of what that person was doing. But I think enslaved persons should mark out to people, this enslaved person is a person. And because it's really easy to miss the fact, I think there was a Louis C.K. bit about, like, there's no limit to what you can achieve if you don't care about the suffering of other people, like talking about building the pyramids. Yeah, no, but we have technology. And I think Dan McClellan might be the first person, and he was talking to Candida Moss about her book, Slavery as a Technology. And I had always thought of technology replacing slavery, but I think understanding a cultural artifact meant to achieve an end of labor, whether it's a bulldozer or a group of human beings who are doing backbreaking labor, that there's an intention there, and that we should, I think, cast back our moral understanding of humanity as, like, these are people, rather than just embracing the dehumanizing moral understanding of the ancient world. Is that putting too fine a point on it, do you think?
No, I completely agree with you.
I
Yeah, I mean, I
Okay.
think the difficulty is often in our language, enslaved person, enslaved worker, enslaver, right? Becomes sometimes repetitive, and but I think it's important, repetitive or not,
Mhm.
right? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, especially when we get so many texts from the ancient world. I think about Cato's De Agricultura or Varro's agricultural manual as well. And they really do talk about enslaved workers as technology, as the techne, the arts that will get things done. Which of course also reminds me of some of Edward Baptist's work on The Half Has Never Been Told, where he really shows the ways that American enslavers tweaked that technology and made that technology more efficient. And I'm really aware of the ways that I'm objectifying thousands of people to talk about them as technology. And yet that's the rhetoric that enslavers use in order to take away the personhood of those hundreds of people. And so part of what we want to do with this book, and part of what we do with our scholarship, is to really show the ways that those hundreds of people are people first. And they're caught in systems that dehumanize, but also, and this is Javal Coleman talks about this in the book, but also capitalize on their very humanness in order to create something that the enslaver or master can capitalize on, right? So, when we start to talk about structures of dependency and independency, and Jared, this was one of your other questions. When we start to talk about dependency and independency, one of the things that we often forget is that enslavers are fully, completely dependent on their labor force for almost everything in their lives. And they will never tell you that. They'll never tell you that in their writings. You have to see it by reading through the cracks and underneath the rhetoric.
There's not really a question here. This is more just me thinking out loud. So I want to hear whatever response you have to this. I think I guess we'll say moral and ethical, possibly even theological benefit to people gaining a better understanding of the historical context, particularly around something that is an institution that we at least don't overtly have in 21st century United States. Well, I know overtly it's so it's not like it's not necessarily well, I was about to say legally enshrined, but I've seen the 13th. So, but we can think of ourselves as having progressed, and I think that's like I don't know, that's a way of reading history that I'm not crazy about. We're just moving forward, but putting it in moral and ethical terms that we can now use as a touchstone. A thing I like to say is people are people and we're not that special. That maybe some of the same conflicts, some of the same challenges that we're having right now are the same thing. And so I don't know that I, as a middle-aged man in 21st century America who has never faced enslavement, should try to say, well, I can put myself in, but I am working class. So how much can I understand being someone who is required to work for a living? How can I understand how my society is put together? And are there similarities? And is there a question I need to ask myself about? Is there a pursuit of justice? And is the power that we have laid out, is it meeting that pursuit? And so, again, no question there, but I will accept correction. I like agreement, but I'll accept correction if it's there.
There's so much in what you said, Jared. I mean, there's so much there, so many comparisons to make. And I'm going to point to Yvonne Zimmerman's chapter in our book on modern slavery, the Bible. It's called Modern Slavery, the Bible, and Slow Down Ethics. And one of the things that Zimmerman really talks about are sort of the ways that we can identify structures of slavery within working groups in particular, right? And so she's really careful to say, hey, look, many, 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 many people work very hard to the detriment of their bodies and souls, and yet still can go home at night and make decisions about their bodies can make decisions about their food, can make decisions about where they move, where they go. And while I know that social networks often play into those decision-making pieces, one of the things that I think Zimmerman is really clear about is that any kind of containment that curtails those decisions about movement, about association, and about the ability to move employment, even, right? Those pieces become pieces that shoot up red flags for contemporary systems of enslavement. And so you mentioned the 13th Amendment. Of course, criminalization in the modern prison system is one way that by definition fits enslavement. Right. IDs are taken away. You're not allowed to wear the clothes you want to wear. You're not allowed to have all of the social contacts you usually have. You're not allowed to leave or move freely. But then there are also workers in the US whose passports are taken away, who are, taken to and from their work site and not allowed to leave the places where they live or the places where they work. And these are in fact systems of modern slavery. And the lines, of course, are squidgy. But part of what Zimmerman's asking us to do is to just slow down and really analyze what it is that we're looking at when we look at systems of labor in particular.
And if I may, sorry, Christy, I'm not sure if you wanted to jump in, but if I may, so bringing up criminalization, as Jeremy Williams told us, and I know he's not the only one, but in his book, criminalization is a thing we decide. So criminalization in Acts of the Apostles is a thing that was decided by people within the Roman Empire. And it just so happened that Christians were on the losing end of that at that time. But a lot of people who identify as Christians in our society are willing to accept in an Aristotelian way that criminalization is like, we went and we just picked it off a tree, that it came to us from nature, that we mined it out of the ground, but it is a thoroughly artificial thing. And in the same way that we made it, we can change it. And again, so Christy, did you have any thoughts?
You and I were on the same wavelength, because I think I was thinking about that too. But then also with Jeremy Williams' chapter, which is on race and ethnicity, is this, this sort of product of our reading of the New Testament in particular and issues of slavery led to, the enslavement of Black humans in America, right? And so this race and ethnicity is intertwined within this conversation. And of course, the incarceration rates we know are not, are disproportionately more Black people are incarcerated, right, in the United States. And so we have all of these different connections that certainly relate back to our reading of biblical texts and the Bible's, and the New Testament in particular, the sort of push towards and justification for slavery has been used to support enslavement throughout history and within Christianity as well. And so I think that it's all entangled, our view of slavery, our reading of slavery in the New Testament, and slavery throughout history, systemic racism, and incarceration, right? It all has lines drawn throughout.
And so, Christy, you actually start your chapter talking about Peter, and when he's denying Jesus, the finger is being pointed at him by an enslaved person. And that, so like, as we're sitting down, it's 7 April. The last episode I released was a conversation with John Dunn about the 1993 movie, The Judas Project. I don't know if you've ever seen it, but so it's kind of like if Jesus appeared in 1990s America. Okay. And the denial scene it happens like 8 feet away from Jesse, who is the Jesus character. And it's one of the henchmen, I think, or one of the villains who makes the accusation. And I bring that up, not just because my brain meanders. I bring that up because you talk about how we need to pay attention when we're reading these texts and maybe read against the grain and look for the things that we're missing. Clearly, the people who wrote that movie missed the point by putting someone who's either armed or empowered in the position of saying these words. And so I don't know if you want to say something about the reading against the grain, the hermeneutics of suspicion kind of thing.
Oh, that's so interesting. Yes. I mean, I haven't seen that film, so I'm going to have to look it up too. No more.
It's free on YouTube and it's worth every penny.
Okay. Great. But I think, I mean, yeah, I think especially the first questioner of Peter is often, most readers don't notice that she is enslaved. And that's going back to the sort of translational issues. That's one problem, is that she's not often, if you read the Greek, you can notice it, but in the English translations, that's sometimes obscured, right? But even in translations where she is noted to be an enslaved woman, often people don't just read right past it and don't notice it. And you're exactly right about the power imbalance there. For an enslaved woman in that space to speak up would have been really pretty unexpected and unheard of in that moment. And especially pointing out, calling out who we think of as a free man, meaning Peter, right? And to move to that hermeneutics of suspicion, I think that is how we start noticing the presence of enslaved persons in the text, is through reading reading sort of between the lines, in the gaps of the text. Knowing our historical context can help with that, because when we know that the labor of enslaved persons was used for everything from cooking to serving to dressing and bathing to childbirth, right? Creating of all sorts of materials that are used in the ancient world. All of that is so important. And so those enslaved persons are there behind the scenes in pretty much every page of our New Testament.
And I know Katherine, your chapter begins with, and if you're watching the video on Patreon, with that, which is a kind of a static display of greeting by an enslaved person, right? And that's their place, like not confronting free men about their mendacity, but quietly serving, right?
Well, or what I would say is that's the place that their enslaver would like them to be. Because of course enslavers want their enslaved people to show their power, right? To show their good mastery, right? Their ability to order their households well, which is a phrase we hear in First Timothy around bishops and deacons in particular. And so like she's displaying the ideal in the enslaver's mind of what an enslaved woman would be like. But as I think our gospel texts show us, and as that example that Christy uses shows us, enslaved women have much more nuanced capabilities within the ancient world and much more nuanced roles to play than we often give them. We often just sort of see them on the wall, literally, as that fresco is. But they're doing a lot of work, and I think part of what is so interesting about our New Testament texts is that they show us some of these things. And we're not always ready to see them, in part because it implicates then our beloved heroes of the Christian faith in slavery and in slavery systems and in participation in the enslaving processes and continuations.
Yeah, it's very challenging. So because we're kind of coming up on time here, I like to start to land the plane by asking, and we'll go Katherine and then Christy. Was there something you were hoping I would ask about from the book in general or your chapter that I failed to ask about? And there's a lot. There always is.
I was just gonna say, I mean, I think, one of the things that I hope what listeners have heard in this conversation is just how rich the book is. We haven't even hit on all of the chapters. There's a chapter on stereotypes and the theater and the ways that the theater actually plays into enslaved stereotypes in the ancient world. There's a chapter on Jewish slavery, which helps us get at some of the nuances between Christian and Jewish practices that help us get out of us kind of Christian anti-Judaism, right? Where we think, oh, well, they were okay with slaves and Christians weren't. Well, okay, it doesn't work that way. I think just the breadth, the metaphors. Marianne Karatzow has a chapter on metaphors of enslavement that really get at this intertwining of gender, stereotype, and the theological metaphor that God is our master. And really helps us to unpack some of those. So, I mean, I think, I could go on. There's so many great things. I think one of the great things about this book too is that there are multiple ways in which material culture comes into play, whether that's image or object or inscriptions, or as you saw the fresco, those of you who are watching the video. I think that those material objects, we can't discount them because the ancient people didn't wander around with just these texts in their heads and a neutral space around them. Just like we don't wander around with just these texts in our heads and neutral space around us. So thinking about the environment, the objects that are around enslaved people that they created, that they, that also contain them are really important pieces of this book as well.
And Christy, was there anything you were hoping I would ask about that I did not?
Yeah, I mean, I liked the question that you had about personal study of biblical texts. So how would people sort of apply hermeneutics of suspicion, or what I might say is, how do we take a study of ancient slavery and use that in our personal reading? And I mean, I think that that's really important because I think a lot of times when we come to the text, we are looking for sort of, we're looking sometimes for comfort, or we're looking sometimes to be challenged, or we're looking for answers, right? And the problems with ancient slavery are that our current context, at least in contemporary United States, let's say, is that we aren't operating in a system of slavery in the same way that the ancient world was. So it's a very different context than we come to in the ancient world. But as we've discussed, there are a lot of threads that are tied to our contemporary world. And so I think there's a lot that we can learn and we can be challenged by when thinking about ancient slavery. And we hope that the book is helpful for those readers who are turning to the New Testament and want to ask those questions, that they'll be able to use the chapters in the book to enhance their personal study as well.
And so one of the features that I really like is at the end of each of the chapters, there's suggested, for further reading. So I will, from each of your chapters, I will make sure I have that. And look, just to anyone who contributed to this book, if you're listening, check your spam folder. I will have sent you an email. I wanted to get this one under my belt before I started inviting others. But so in addition to that, though, Christy, what would you recommend listeners read, listen to, watch, or whatever other medium? And then we'll go to Katherine on this to learn more about slavery in the ancient world generally and gender and sexuality within that context.
Yeah, that's good. That's a good question. I mean, I think Jennifer Glancy's Slavery in Early Christianity is just, it's an amazing text, and it was written a number of years ago. It has not lost any of its appeal. There's a revised version that has just come out. And so that one is also, it's even more sort of relevant. But I would start there. It's a great resource. Jennifer Glancy also does pull in issues of gender throughout her study of slavery in early Christianity as well. I will also just recommend Jeremy Williams' book, especially if he was a previous podcast guest. It's a brilliant book that interrogates issues of slavery and criminalization in Acts. Katherine, what would you add to that list?
Yeah, I mean, certainly I'm going to just exponentially highlight Glancy's Slavery in Early Christianity. It really is paradigmatic for all that I do as a scholar. But I would also say, some of the womanist biblical scholars are doing some really interesting work around the intricacies of status in particular. So Mitzi Smith, these are at the end of my chapter. Mitzi Smith's Chloe and Her People and Shively Smith's Strangers to Family are just incredible ways, I think, especially in this moment, of thinking about power dynamics and slavery and its legacies. The other one that I would highlight is Angela Parker. Her If God Still Breathes, Why Can't I? Particularly for it doesn't speak to slavery directly, but it does speak to infallibility in the biblical text, which is often one of the issues that those of us who study slavery come up against. Precisely because if everything that's in the New Testament is right and true, just as it's spoken, if it means what it means, then
Thank you for that.
then there's a real problem. There's a huge crisis around how much slavery is infused into that sense of the biblical text. And I think Parker's takedown of infallibility really helps one to reckon with that in many ways.
I love me some Angela Parker. She's the reason I met Jeremy Williams, and Mitzi Smith and Angela Parker. Follow them on Instagram. They have fun feeds to follow. Angela Parker is Boozy Bible Scholar. So if you're looking for a good time, go check her out over there. So we'll go Katherine, then Christy. What do you read for fun?
Historical fiction right now.
anything
specific?
I have recently been on a Kristen Hanna kick, and her characters bring me to tears, and they're so complex. But I could also name, dozens more.
Well, look, if you don't want to do it now, feel free to shoot me an email, and they will end up.
I mean, anything by Toni Morrison. Like, seriously, for listeners of this particular podcast, Toni Morrison's A Mercy is one of the best historical, I would just say plain old historical readings of enslavement in the 17th century New York. It's just incredible.
Okay. And Christy, what do you read for fun?
I sort of like read a ton of novels, and I really like murder mysteries, which has nothing to do with the Bible. So, I mean, every once in a while, there's one that deals with something biblical, but most of the time I'm reading sort of these interesting, mystery novels related to this book. I recently read the novel James by Percival Everett, which is a retelling of Huckleberry Finn, but through the lens of the male enslaved character James.
Jim.
And so exactly.
Okay.
And it was really good. I loved it. I finished it like January, I think. And I just thought it was so well done, and really it was just an engaging read, and also interesting thinking about rereading books from the perspective of the enslaved.
I had not heard of that. I love retellings from a different perspective in general, like Wicked.
You'll like this one.
Yeah, well, and I just found out now I'm excited. I just found, and it's up here. Yeah. So I was just kind of walking around Barnes and Noble, and Gregory Maguire. So he wrote Wicked, Son of a Witch, Lion Among Men, and Out of Oz, but I guess he continued it, and there's like a sequel series. So I'm very excited about that. And I'll just throw this to you. I don't know if you read fantasy, but I'm reading a book by Naomi Novik right now called A Deadly Education. And it's this magical school, and there are no teachers. The kids are just locked in this building, and evil creatures like smell their magic, and they want to eat the kids. And the kids have to keep themselves alive and learn everything they need to know to graduate, which is really just like a hyper-focused version of that. But you have like a magical predilection that determines what spells the void that this school is in gives to you when you need to learn things and solve problems. And it sounds like a metaphor for the algorithm. So our children, I don't know if you, but like the children in my house, excuse me, are interacting with an algorithm that looks at their predilection and is just like, well, here, I'll give you this. And if you don't like that, you still have to engage with it to get more stuff behind it. Anyway, this is the first book I've read by her. And I don't, it's very good. I find books every once in a while that I just get really excited about and I won't shut up about. And the listeners have to hear about it for like 5 episodes because I tend to record these things all condensed together. But, you know, as my wife likes to remind me, it's your podcast. You can do whatever you want. So unless the two of you have anything else for me, I feel confident calling this one good. Are we good to go?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Katherine Shaner, Christy Cobb, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you,
Thank
Jared.
you for having us.
Okay. Take care. Thank you so much for listening. As always, as I said on the top end, as I said on the front end of the episode, please hit me up with any feedback. I want for us to all keep in mind with regard to a subject like slavery, that it may seem far in the past, but it still has its ugly tentacles in our world. I think some of the way that people talk about politics or commerce or economics or just civic life in general, public life, does carry some of a dormant virus of the kind of society that welcomed and encouraged enslaving other human beings. And I think a book like this helps us learn about what it looked like in the ancient world and maybe gives us a way to avoid continuing doing it now, or even just the vestigial pieces it's left in our world. Maybe we remove those. So that said, next week on the podcast is Timothy Lee, and we will be discussing his article, Jude's Use of a Kaige Edition of Enochic Scripture. And if you don't know what a Kaige edition of Enochic Scripture is, you are not alone. I did not either. And that was one of the many benefits of talking to Timothy Lee. So here is a quick preview of that. And if you get a chance to love someone, you should take it. How do you understand the motivation of revising texts in the ancient world? Can you explain that?
Okay, let's work this through. It's a very expensive process to revise any text. You think about the paper, the time, the skills. I think we've got to be careful about drawing too strong a parallel, but I think there are parallels with Homeric scholarship in Alexandria, where critical editors in the early days of the library set out to revise Homer and to think, what did Homer write, rather than what had been accrued over the years. And they set about to edit it, to revise it towards fitting what they thought, in their views, Homer wrote. And there might be parallels there with both the Proto-Masoretic text and the Hebrew side of things, and Kaige revision of the Septuagint. I don't think I list it here. I'm not sure I have an article on it, but there will be one day an article saying why is there any revision at all. And there's four or five different options. You can read, there's an article by Sebastian Brock, 1990. It's a white SBL volume, I can't remember what it's called. The Scrolls and the Septuagint, I think it was, edited by maybe George Brooke, I can't remember. Conference. Brock's article is to revise or not to revise, and he put sort of a few views as to why you might revise the text of the Septuagint. For him, he thought it was maybe a more theological thing, a view of scripture or debates, where there is evidence for that in the Syriac tradition in the 6th century with the what did he have? Philonixian, a revision of the Peshitta, where they're revising it towards the Greek and so on for some debates. You have it later on in the modern world, say with the Revised Bible that came, the American Standard Bible, and then the RSV Bible, which were revising initially the King James Bible towards what they thought was something closer to the Hebrew and modern Hebrew scholarship or Greek scholarship, the New Testament, or different texts. In the ancient world, there might be some parallels, but you've got to be careful. You don't want to impose them. So why revise? Why Kai-Get? Why Proto-MT? I think it's just something you do. If you have lots of texts around and you have a central repository or a library, it can cause issues to hear people citing different texts of Jeremiah or something. And I think when there's an awareness of these differences, people set out to just fix. I think it's just human nature to have a more fixed form.